This is the people of the state of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12 CR 1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. For the record, the prosecution has marked People's Exhibits P-TR-1260 and 1261 as C-TR 84 and 85. Respectively. And I mentioned that I sustained the hearsay objection, and I said that the foundation required by Rule 703 had not been satisfied. I also find that the probative value of these exhibits in assisting the jury to evaluate Dr. Gurr's opinions does not substantially outweigh the prejudicial effect of these exhibits. Here you go. Thank you. Have the people had enough time to think about the defense's proposal in terms of publication of video recordings that have been admitted?
Your Honor, the defense, I think, should be able to play whatever portion they think is appropriate, and I guess if we think it's misleading, we would have the opportunity in rebuttal to play the other part, but I doubt very much we'd do that.
Okay, I think that's exactly right. So without objection, that's how we'll proceed. And Mr. King, if you want me to tell the jury or to inform the jury that with respect to the one exhibit, that's all you're seeking to publish, then I can do that, or you can do that, either way. I'm not requiring it. I'm just saying they haven't been told that it's only going to be partially played. We played part of it, and then I think it was the end of the day, and we had to adjourn. And so they may wonder about the rest of that video. So
I can say it, or the court can say it. I don't have a preference. I think they should be told one way or the other. But
I agree.
if you perhaps, is the court going to take a break when we're done with Dr. Gurr, or do you want to roll right into that portion? Or
well, if you're going to call your investigator, what I thought we would do is I would ask you if you to call your next witness, have you call your investigator, and then take a break at that point. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Okay, let's do it that way. Okay. One other question. Is defense asking for my assistance in any way with respect to the two statements that I had excluded and later concluded should be admitted? Are you seeking my assistance in terms of getting that witness back or anything along those lines? No?
Two statements are we talking?
Judge, can you remind us what the state?
There was a statement related to Mr. Holmes doing something with a hair gel bottle and a light bulb, and there was another statement related to, I think, maybe a spoon and an electrical outlet. These were both statements in the jail. I had excluded them, and then later I said they should be admitted. I said they were admissible under a hearsay exception. I think it was 8033. But then yesterday or the day before, when I talked about the Wyoming Supreme Court's decision in TOTH, T-O-T-H, I found that in addition, they are admissible as non-hearsay, and perhaps not in addition, but that they're actually admissible as non-assertions or non-statements under the discussion in that case. And I've indicated a couple of times that to the extent the defense needs the court's assistance in getting that sheriff deputy back on the stand, the court will provide that assistance. Or if you want to call a different witness to get the statements in, or if you want to do it through an expert witness to get the statements in, frankly, I think that they may be in already from other experts. I'm not sure, but it's up to you. So I just want to make sure that if you're asking for my assistance to compel the witness's appearance, that you let me know. Okay? All right. Okay, let's bring the jury in, please. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury's back in the courtroom. It's kind of interesting to look at all of you folks because some of you are dressed for winter and some of you are dressed for summer. And it has to do with the location of the air and your preference for temperature. But I was just noticing that how differently dressed you seem to be every day. All right, it's good to have you back in the courtroom. Dr. Gurr, I remind you that you're still under oath. And Mr. King, you may proceed with the rest of your redirect. Actually, Mr. King, before you do, let me inform the jury that with respect to P-TR-1260 and 1261, or is it 1261 and 1262? 61 and 62. I sustain the objection to those two exhibits. Okay, with that, Mr. King, you may proceed.
Doctor, I'm winding down here. Doctor, you were asked some questions about words that Mr. Holmes used and whether or not they came from him or not. Did Mr. Holmes ever say to you that he wanted to put people out of their misery? Or is that not a comment he made to you?
I don't recall him making this comment to me.
Mr. Brockler also talked a lot about doing them a favor was the phrase that came up a lot, that Mr. Holmes was doing the victims a favor. Mr. Holmes ever used that phrase with you?
I do not recall.
You don't recall one way or another, or you don't?
I do not recall that he used it.
Now, we talked some about freezing, and you talked about how that worked yesterday. And I just wanted to ask you a question about that. If this freezing fear of other people was so intense, how is it that Mr. Holmes could, have a girlfriend for 4 months and have, a few friends and talk when called on in class? Do you have an opinion about that?
Yes. Okay, the objection is overruled. Mr. King, you may proceed.
Do you remember the question, Doctor, or do you want me to ask it again?
He asked me about freezing and how compatible is the freezing that he described with graduate school experience and having a girlfriend.
And having friends and being able to answer in class, things like that.
So the freezing experience was intense during high school. This is when it started. And he was in a high school of about 4,000 kids. And he described it, and this was the time that I detailed, I think yesterday, or the day, I don't remember, I think yesterday or the day before, that when walking down the hallways, he will feel very fearful of other and describe the experience as freezing, with shortness of breath and feeling like a doom sense will come over him. When in undergraduate, in the first year, he lived in a dorm, and the social activities were initiated commonly by other students, not by him. And he was focusing on his education, on getting good grades. When he moved off campus, he spent more time by himself, avoiding social interactions that made him extremely anxious. In graduate school, according to him, he made a decision, I made a decision that the academics are less important and that I'd like to focus more on socializing. It's a small group in the neuroscience graduate group. A few people admitted a year, and he was, while anxious before seeing the people, he got used to them. So among people that he knew already and had contact with, were familiar, he felt less anxious. So I believe that while the freezing anxiety was intense in a large crowd of graduate school and was reduced if undergraduate, in high school and undergraduate, and was less intense during his first semester in graduate school with familiar people.
Thank you. You were asked some questions about the selfie photos that Mr. Holmes took and the reasons for those photos that he gave you and Dr. Reed. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And what was the reason that Mr. Holmes told you he took those pictures? And I believe it was on your interview on August 5th, 2014, that he gave you that information. Do you recall what he said about that?
That it was so that, I don't have the words, although it's in my note, but the essence of it was that to show that he could have obtained the weapons without being detected or without being stopped. I have the exact wording if you want me to look for it.
Why don't you look for it real quickly if you could? Because I don't want to misstate it.
Okay, and that's in...
August 5th, 2014, I believe. Page 22.
August 2014. I'm reading from my note, pictures to show that any person can buy it without regulation. He thought someone will be checking when he got the weapons.
And do you remember that you were, Mr. Brockler talked about the fact that Mr. Holmes told Dr. Reed that he took the photos, quote, to be remembered. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
Do you remember from watching the Dr. Reed's videotaped examination that this again was another subject that Dr. Reed suggested that answer to Mr. Holmes not once but repeatedly? Do you recall that or no?
Yes.
Now you were asked about the notebook.
Yes.
And there's this long series of questions about the notebook. About whether Mr. Holmes, do you remember being asked whether Mr. Holmes wrote from left to right in the notebook?
Yes, I didn't teach him to write from right to left.
That he wrote on the lines?
Yes.
That he wrote in words?
Yes.
That he didn't scrawl in the margin?
No.
That he drew lines and boxes and kept his writing within the lines and the boxes? Do you
Yes.
recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
Did any of those things have any psychiatric significance with regard to this notebook?
I don't believe so.
Is it the content of the writings that is psychiatrically significant about this notebook?
Yes.
Can you please explain to us what your opinions are about the psychotic content of these writings?
The, 'cause, 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 ' he describes, or what he presents in the notebook, is his delusional system and his effort to describe it, to detail it, to taking it out from his head, from his brain, and put it on paper. So he provides the symbols that characterize his delusional system, the infinity symbol, some of the things that we went over yesterday. A lot of it is difficult to understand because it makes no sense. A graduate student with his level of IQ, this is not a typical notebook that somebody will take or describe unless it is related to intensive experiences of his delusions. I mean, if you look at it page by page of why does the value of a person even matter? Justice. If people are ultimately good or evil in value, then more may suffer from injustice. If life has no values, this is one sentence leading to another sentence. I had to read it several times to try to connect the point that if I read a written effort of multiple pages from somebody with an IQ of over 120, I don't expect that. It reflects, regardless of the neatness, by that time somebody like him can write on lines. He's been writing on lines all his life, and he has been writing legibly in his work. But to produce the content that has no relationship to reality, a belief that is not shared by anybody else, and is rambling in nature while putting, a label on it, doesn't make it a normal verbal expression of thought processes that are common to all of us as human beings. It's unique to him. It describes a depth of an extensive delusion that has permeated his life and he's been adhering to.
Is the same true of the writings that he made in the jail after his arrest?
Yes, but there is writing in the margins, and I don't attribute to it any significance.
Is it the content
The
again?
content is delusional in nature. If you read it, you can tell me that you have met any other person that writes these bizarre thoughts, nihilistic in nature. It just doesn't exist. Normal people don't write things like that, especially people with this level of intelligence, unless they're really sick, mentally deficient and defective in a psychotic process. And that's what it reflects.
Thank you. You were asked some about an incident in the jail where Mr. Holmes tried to remove a bar from inside his cell. Did you review those police reports ever?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And when the deputies asked Mr. Holmes why he was doing that, what did he say to them? Do you remember?
I think that he said that the word metal, he said metal, that he wanted metal, I believe. And they followed up on it,
okay.
as I recall, and he said that he wanted the metal to protect himself.
From whom?
From other inmates. And then they reassured him that they are there and that for his protection. That's their job to do, and that they're there, they will protect him.
And was that the end of that?
Yes.
In this case, first, Mr. Brockler questioned you quite extensively about planning. And he did that yesterday, and he did it today. about planning actions that took place prior to July 20th, 2012, and actions that took place on July 20th, 2012. How do you square that with your opinions that Mr. Holmes was not legally sane at the time? If he's insane, how in the world is he able to plan and carry out such a complicated, seemingly complicated act?
Perhaps I can make 2 points. One is the activities that he carried on were within his delusional system that he had to complete a mission. That once he said it, it had to be done no matter what. So all of those activities were within his delusional system to maximize the success and his ability to carry it out. That's one point. It's within the delusional system. This was the nature of his delusion. The delusions have propelled him to commit this act. I do not believe that without the delusion and without being mentally ill, this would have ever happened. The second point is that in some way he's almost on a class of his own when you look at people that are so high functioning and are so engulfed in a delusion. And this has enabled him. He has such a high IQ. If his IQ and his cognitive abilities would have been average, it would have been hard for him to carry it on. So what we have is a combination of a very high intellectual person, intellectual, gifted in many ways, individual with cognitive abilities, a pervasive delusional system, an effort to adapt to school where he perceives that he is not going to be able to pursue his life goal of being a neuroscientist, and the only relationship, close, intimate relationship, that he is so hard to ride, that he felt that this is a part that is strange about him, that is different, fell apart. It created a perfect storm. And when he verbalized it, as he said it, the floodgates were open.
Is your diagnosis of schizophrenia in this case a close call?
No.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
That's all I have. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you,
All right,
Doctor.
Thank you. Do you have recross, Mr. Brockland?
I do, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, you may proceed.
Doctor, one of the things that you were asked a lot about on redirect was how you viewed your report. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And whether or not the details in the report matter in terms of the quotes. Do you recall that conversation? Right before lunch?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, one of the things I thought I just heard you tell Mr. King is the defendant did not tell you he wanted to put people out of his misery. Did you just confirm that he didn't say that to you?
I think that it did not.
He did not tell you that?
That I didn't put, I don't remember that it's in my report.
Now, I don't want this to sound crazy, but I am looking at page 9 of your report. If you could get there, that'd be super. The third paragraph below visit number 2 that begins, he described. Just let me know when you get there, ma'am.
You're looking at February 9th morning
Yes,
section?
ma'am. Do you see that? I want you to go down to that third paragraph that begins, he described himself.
Yes.
And I want you to find the sentence, and you check me if I'm misreading this. He understood he could not accomplish that goal, comma, and felt shooting others, and here's the interesting part, a quote, can rid them of their problems and put them out of their misery, period, end quote. Do you see that
Yes,
Did you write that?
yes,
You put it in quotes because, as you told us yesterday, you can take it to the bank. These are the words he said, correct?
yes.
Then why did you agree with Mr. King moments ago he didn't say it?
Perhaps I misunderstood this question.
Do you feel like it was a tricky question?
No, but I do not recall every sentence that I put in
That's
in the
interesting.
report.
Thank you, because you seem to recall the details of jail log notes about a metal bar that was removed back in the first part of 2012. Do you recall that conversation you just had?
Yes,
Tell us how much time you spent prepping with Mr. King between my cross-examination and the redirect that you went through this morning. How much time?
talking to Mr. King,
Yep, or anyone on the defense team to prepare yourself for this morning.
maybe an hour.
Okay, so you got yourself ready by preparing the documents you would be asked about by Mr. King for this afternoon, correct? Correct?
Not for some of the question, that specific question, yes.
There's some other things you agreed to with Mr. King that I want to go over. Do you remember when, right before lunch, Mr. King said, you recall reading in the reports that the defendant pulled away from his friends Ben Garcia, Gargi Dada, and Tim Tapscott in 2012. Do you recall that?
Yes,
Yeah. It stuck out to me because we haven't heard from a guy named Tim Tapscott in this case. But you'll recall that there's a report in here about him from the FBI, and I'm going to ask you if you remember this, where he says he maintained close contact with this group until the end of December 2011, when their core classes ended and the four were assigned to new classes and laboratory assignments. Do you recall that?
I do not recall the details. I didn't recall the name of the last name. I remember there was a team in the group, and there were, 2 or 3 females and 2 or 3 males. But I know that it did have, during the first semester, the fall, when school started at the end of August and early September of 2011, he did have friends, he did well in school. It was after the Christmas break, when he was coming back to the second phase, is when his difficulties increased in nature, and it was harder for him in school and to maintain the friendship with people. So I don't...
Yeah, Doctor, that's an incredibly detailed answer about what you didn't remember when Mr. King asked you the question, but why didn't you give that when Mr. King asked you the question? Why did you readily agree, yes, I remember that? Why did you do that with him?
Objection, argumentative.
I'm not...
Hold on, overruled.
Go ahead, Doctor.
I'm not sure what you're asking me.
Why did you agree with Mr. King that the defendant broke up with or stopped seeing or pulled away from Tim Tapscott in 2012, if that's not true? Is it another detail that you didn't remember?
No, he did decrease his interactions with other people. He did not maintain close contact and socialize with the same group of people as 2012
Doctor,
proceeded.
Did you understand Mr. King's question to include the name Tim Tapscott? Did you remember him saying that?
I don't remember the last name.
So now we're just going to agree to things that sound right. Is that fair?
Objection, argumentative.
I'm not sure what you asked.
Hold on. Sustain us to the form, it says we, you can rephrase.
Doctor, is it fair to say then that some of the answers you gave on redirect were just answering to the gist of the question, not the details of the question?
If you mean by the detail, if I remembered every name of a person and Mr. King said the names and said that the last name, I assume that the last name of Tim is what it is. But I know from the interviews and all the information available that in the second semester, 2012, was different from the first one. And I was asking in general, were there changes? Was he decreasing his relationship? And the answer was yes.
Doctor, did you understand Mr. King's question, giving 3 specific first and last names, to be a question about in general? Is that how you understood the question?
About his relationship with graduate students. There were very few graduate students in the class. I don't see the relevance of it.
I bet. Let's ask, though, about, aren't the details to all of this...
I'm going to object to the commentary. It's argumentative.
Sustained, but also the statement by the witness that she doesn't see the relevant is improper as well. So, next question.
Doctor, the details are important, aren't they?
It depends for what.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, for instance, the book. Do you remember that Mr. King asked you about the section of the book on if your adolescent has schizophrenia that we talked about, where you emphasized the importance of contacting directly family members to get input on the life of the potential schizophrenic? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And the conversation you had with Mr. King, the gist of it was, hey, that's misleading because that's a book about adolescents who live at home and the same rules don't apply to everyone else. Do you remember that?
I don't believe I said it in these words, but
Well, you tell me the words you think you want to apply to that then. Is
To
it
the-
just as important with an adult to have contact directly with the family as it is with an adolescent? Yes or no?
it depends.
Okay. Let me help you focus on the it depends part. Do you remember a guy named Philipposian?
Yes.
He was a guy, in fact, he's one of the only two other times you've ever testified in your capacity as a psychiatrist. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to, by the way, so that we know, Mr. Philipposian wasn't an adolescent, was he?
No, he was a young adult.
He was a young adult, and he was living in an unfurnished apartment all by himself, wasn't he?
Yes.
He had completely withdrawn from his family, correct?
Yes.
Refusing to go to weddings, refusing to participate in holiday or dinner events, correct?
Yes.
And yet, when questioned, you said, and tell me if you agree that you said this under oath, it is only by listening to family members, getting details of day-to-day events at home, activities, comparison with other children, that you have this individual's, the potential patient, details of reality in the family. So I requested to see the family. Furthermore, you said, I told you in the beginning, and this is you responding to the attorney that hired you, I will see him, but I'd like to apply the same high level of standard procedures that would apply to any person, regardless of the legal issue, that I would have been deviating from the procedure that I adhere to, mainly the corroborating evidence. So you called the family and you spoke with them for 2.5 hours. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So you would not limit your commitment to wanting to get outside information from family members to adolescents who live at home, correct? Correct?
Yes, but it's more complex in that case.
I'm sure.
The commentary.
Well, but she's also going beyond the response to the question. So sustain us to the commentary, and then I'm going to instruct the witness to answer the question and only the question. Next question, please.
Your statement about wanting to consider the forest, do you remember that instead of like the trees? Do you remember that with Mr. King? The forest of information? Did you say something like that?
I think so, yeah.
To be fair, what you don't agree with, though, is the idea of presenting the forest in a report. Fair?
I believe that the report I provided is the forest, is the big picture, without writing down every detail.
The details are not part of the forest.
They are. That's how the forest was made. It's made out of trees.
Okay.
The
and
details.
And frankly, you'd agree you saved a bunch by writing a 14-page report. Agreed?
Objection to saved a bunch.
Sustain.
All right, doctor, let's do this. When you wrote that report, you said, hey, I thought that I was just writing a report to capture my thoughts on this, some things I thought were important, and I'd have the chance to come here and testify. Do you remember that?
Yes.
The reality is that your June 17th, 2013 report was written after you knew that Dr. Jeffrey Metzner, the court-appointed psychiatrist, had been appointed on June 4th to conduct an independent sanity evaluation of the defendant, right?
I don't remember the
Relevance, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Right?
I don't remember the dates.
Because of the nature of this case and the fact that you knew that the defendant had entered a plea of guilty, of not guilty by reason of insanity. Because of that, you knew that your report wasn't just going to set you up to come testify, that other mental health professionals would be reviewing that report, correct?
Yes.
And the difference between the report you generated and the one generated by two board-certified forensic psychiatrists was in detail, and the detailed statements and the detailed corroboration supporting their opinions. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, When we talk about the forest is really contained in large part in 23 hours of videotape by Dr. Reed, isn't it? Right? You got to see every question, every answer, every facial reaction, every follow-up, correct?
Yes,
All the things that were omitted from your reports and your notes, right?
not all the things.
There were other things that were
Some-
omitted? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
What I mean, okay.
And frankly, ma'am, your ability, to say nothing about your willingness to want to critique a board-certified forensic psychiatrist on his interviewing techniques, is only possible because he recorded every single interaction he had with that guy right over there, correct? Right?
Yes,
And on top of that, he still generated a nearly 60-page report detailing every conclusion that he came to and the evidence that supported it. You'd agree with that.
yes,
And Dr. Jeffrey Metzner, whose practice it has never been to videotape, generated a 120-page report. Agreed?
yes,
And part of that report was him going line by line through the notebook with the defendant in like a 30, 40, 50-page addendum. Do you agree with that?
yes,
And because they were able to do that, you, as a mental health professional, were able to go through and scrutinize the information they got, compare it to the information you got, and determine whether or not you agreed with their opinions, correct?
yeah.
They did not have that ability to do that with you, did they?
They had the ability to talk to me and interview me over the telephone and discuss with me
And in
what were
fact,
my impressions, what were my conclusions, how did I derive them, and I provided it to them totally openly. Furthermore, there's remarkable consistency.
Hey, doctor, you've already said this several times. I get it, okay? That was not my question. Let me follow up with you on this, though. One of the things that writing a short report and having few notes permits you is the ability to sit here, doesn't it, and tell everyone in this room, I considered everything, even if I didn't write it down. And he told me all these things, even if I didn't document them. And I remember them all. Doesn't that permit you the ability to do that?
Under oath,
Yes, I understand, under oath. Doesn't it permit you to do that?
yes,
If the purpose of the report is to simply signal to other people, I analyzed everything, I talked about everything, he's schizophrenic, and he's insane, why not just send in a postcard?
because the information we send reports as a standard of any evaluation, and as I said before, the standard for neuropsychiatric evaluation is different than a forensic evaluation, and my report is not a postcard. It is 14 and a half pages with documentation that followed standard neuropsychiatric evaluation and provides sufficient details that I can explain in the court on the psychiatric history of Mr. Holmes and his presentation to me during, by that time, 13 hours of interview.
Doctor, you'd agree too that you took more written notes after August of 2014, after Dr. Reed had interviewed the defendant, than you did prior to writing your June 2013 report declaring the defendant insane and schizophrenic. You agree with that?
The notes are longer, partly because while sitting with him, and I knew him already, and he felt comfortable with me, and I could just more easily, while observing him, take notes.
Is the answer to my question yes, you produced far more notes after Dr. Reed interviewed the defendant than you did before you came up with your insanity opinion? Yes?
I didn't tie it to the date, but if it looks like the date is after, yes.
Okay. You agreed with Mr. King something here when we're talking, and we can talk about it with report writing too, I suppose. Is there danger in selecting specific pieces of information and just relying on those?
They can be.
Okay. The quotations matter, don't they? That's why you put quotes on them? They matter?
Yes.
The accuracy of them? Agreed?
Yes.
And as you've testified already, you'd agree you made some mistakes in your report about some of the things you attributed to quotes. You agree with that?
Yes, I think one that we went over.
One of the things that Mr. King asked you about was there any evidence or anything that gave you the indication that the defendant wasn't telling you, being credible or forthcoming or something with you about all of his symptoms and everything he was going through? Do you remember that?
Yes,
Didn't you say yesterday when I was cross-examining you on some of the things that he said that never show up again afterwards, that you said, I didn't take him at his word, I didn't believe everything he said? Didn't you say that?
in reference to wounding people. And when you were questioning me, did you think that he went in really believing that he will just wound people? And I say no. And that later on when we spoke about it, we were discussing his plan to kill people, which was part of his delusion.
Thank you. You would agree then that there was some indication that he was not being completely candid, forthcoming, and accurate and consistent with you, right? Because you didn't believe it, right?
I knew it was, I knew what were the consequences and how he harmed himself and what he planned to do. So my interpretation, and it's an interpretation can be wrong, is that he felt more comfortable telling me at that time that he wanted just to wound people, but it's something that I pursued.
One of the other things that you were asked about was, didn't Dr. Reed talk with the defendant more than 2 years after he'd been medicated and all that other stuff? Do you recall that?
Yes.
And all that other stuff, Your Honor.
It's a long question, Judge. I can't remember it.
Okay, why don't you repeat the question?
Do you remember the conversation with Mr. King about Dr. Reed's interview having taken place a significant period of time after he was medicated, after the defendant was medicated?
Yes.
Yeah. You went and interviewed the defendant 2 more times after that, didn't you? Correct?
Yes.
And you developed, as we've just said, more notes from those meetings than you did before, correct? Right?
For some of the meeting, yeah.
And you considered what he had to say after he met with Dr. Reed in formulating your opinion as well, correct?
Consistent with the previous formulation.
Oh, so it was consistent with your previous formulation. Bless you. I got it. One of the things that you had mentioned, and this is just sort of the order in which these questions were asked, so you'll have to forgive me for less organization. One of the questions you were asked is about, or you stated was, schizophrenics typically have a denial of illness, a denial that anything is wrong, correct?
They can have a denial of illness.
It's actually pretty common, as you've testified to and as appears in both of your books, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
In fact, you've previously testified that it is common for schizophrenics after a first break to not only deny that there's anything wrong with them, but to accuse others of having the problem, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, now in this case, we don't have that, do we? Right?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, how about a guy who writes down in a notebook all the different things he thinks may be wrong with him? That doesn't feel like denial of illness, correct? Correct?
In this case, he knew that he was mentally ill and that he has been ill for some time. Yes.
Yeah, not consistent with what is a pretty common feature in schizophrenia according to your testimony and publications, correct?
Correct.
In fact, he even goes and sees a psychiatrist at the school to talk to them about his anxiety, correct?
Yes.
This guy's not in denial about something going on with him, correct?
Yes.
You were you were asked about the Salinas 8-year-old thing by Mr. King. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that led to his question about, isn't it dangerous to just pick and choose information? Do you recall that?
Yes.
All right. Now, first off, you don't put anything other than taken to counseling for outbursts in your report or your notes at any time about that incident with Salinas, correct?
Yes,
So today when you testify, hey, there were 4 different meetings and none of that made it into your report, correct?
correct.
And the truth is that statement that he lacked socialization, that he was showing introverted behaviors, and that he was Nintendo-oriented, those weren't by observations by any man or woman named Jack. Those were complaints by his parents, correct?
They were part of him, yes.
Again, the details matter, don't they? Don't the details matter?
At times they do.
Let's talk about another detail. You were asked about by Mr. King, I think after cross-examination, about whether or not it really mattered what you wrote in your report was the basis for why the parents took him to see Mel Lipsy. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Why did you write it in your report if it really didn't matter why they took him to go see Mel Lipsy? You put down the 3 things we talked about in your report. You disavowed the third one, which was mom and dad were concerned about his suicidal gesture, which upon reflection you realized, my gosh, they didn't know about it. That was a mistake. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Why list any reason why the parents took him to go see Mel Lipsy if, as you answered with Mr. King on redirect, the real reason doesn't matter? All that matters is that they took him.
Objection, compound question?
Overruled?
Go ahead, doctor.
I don't remember that that's how or that this was the nature of the question or my response.
Okay.
Also, may I?
Go ahead.
Wait, is that the change in his behavior was associated with moving back to San Diego, when at that time he experienced more difficulties with friends, were playing more with computers, and was having just difficulties overall and appeared sad and less happy than he used to be when they lived in Northern California. So because it was a change in his behavior compared to before, I emphasized that in my report.
Doctor, one of the things you testified to on redirect was that his sister had gotten in his face and he had slapped her. Do you recall that?
Yes,
Yeah. Now, what you know is, from having reviewed Dr. Woodcock's notes from whenever they were provided to you, is that is not what he told Dr. Woodcock, is it?
correct.
He told Dr. Woodcock what?
I don't remember.
He told Dr. Woodcock that she'd thrown a basketball in his face.
Ah, right, I remember now. Thank you. She threw a
Again,
basketball in his face, right.
The details, right? Remembering the details, correct? That's tough.
But it's not different than what I said, that he had difficulty with his sister. She was, 5 years younger. And when you mentioned the basketball incident, there were multiple other incidents where he had difficulties with his sister without, a physical touching her. So,
But you testified that the reason he hit her, he slapped her, I wrote it down, was because she'd gotten in his face.
Mhm.
Right? Aren't the details of what you're testifying to here, aren't those important to get right? Or is it the gist of what you're saying?
I provided them right. He was getting in his face. You mentioned more during a basketball game. Yes.
She hit him in the
She
face
hit
with
him
a
in the
bat.
face. Yeah.
That's the same thing. That's the same thing.
Similar.
I got it. One of the other things that Mr. King asked you about was the Iowa graduate school interviews, and he read some quotes to you from some report, correct?
I provided the quotes.
You provided the quotes, thank you. And he asked you, that's psychiatrically significant, correct?
Yes.
Yet that psychiatrically significant event appears nowhere in your reports or your notes, does it?
As I stated repeatedly,
Doctor,
it does not.
Thank you. One of the other things you agreed with Mr. King about was that the defendant had performed poorly in a rotation with a doctor, a professor named Sukumar. Do you recall that? You went through and
No,
read all
I think that there were, we went over several records that
Yes.
he brought over here. One of them was Dr. Sucamore, but there was also a discussion of Mark, I believe.
Do you remember testifying in answer to Mr. King's question that you recall that the defendant performed poorly in a rotation with a professor named Sukumar? Yes or no?
Yes,
You would recall, had you reviewed those things in detail, wouldn't you, that he never had a rotation with anyone named Sukumar? Do you recall that now?
he had coursework with Sucamore.
And that evaluation had nothing to do with coursework, did it? If you don't know the answer, doctor, tell us what that evaluation was really about.
I believe it was regarding a laboratory performance. I think that the ratings that I've shown with the colors of 1, 2, 3.
Doctor, isn't it true that that evaluation was based on a presentation that he gave? Correct?
Yes,
And he was never good at presentations while he was in grad school, was he?
he wasn't as good, but he did okay before with presentations.
The evaluation from Sukumar was his very first presentation. Do you recall that?
In her class.
I'm sorry?
In her class.
Sukumar is a man,
Man,
doctor.
I'm sorry. I thought it was a female.
And that presentation wasn't for his class. Did you know that too?
I don't remember that it...
But you agreed with Mr. King's question about it, right?
Yes.
Mark Delacqua gave him low marks on his second laboratory rotation, and we actually got to hear Dr. Mark Delacqua testify. Tell us why he got low marks in the lab.
He was having some difficulties from the exchange, from the email exchange that I read between him and Dr. Delacqua. He was having some difficulties in lab processing, the technical aspect in the lab.
And again, it was in his performance of the experiment that he was having struggles, correct?
Yes.
Now, what you noticed is after that second lab rotation, according to his grades, that in every class that required a written product, that guy was knocking it out of the park, wasn't he?
He was doing well.
And that was consistent start to stop, wasn't it?
Across the courses.
Yeah. And the thing that you attributed to him failing was another presentation called the prelim exams. Recall that?
Yes.
And when Mr. King read to you the descriptions that the professor, I think, and we heard from this guy too, I think, Dr. Sather, you would agree that those statements are also consistent with someone who'd spent the preceding month not studying, but planning to commit a crime at the Century 16 Theater. Agreed?
Can be a contributor, can also relate to, which I believe, the intensification of his disease, his delusions taking over. So school that he did not experience as a success for him became less important.
One of the things that you testified to was that guys initiating conversations with women through email or text is unusual. Do you remember that?
Object to unusual. That was a mischaracterization.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor. And if you want to use a different word, use a different word.
No, but-
there was an exchange between you and Mr. King about how somebody reaching out to women in 2010, 2011, 2012 by text or email was not really indicative of an effort to have a social relationship. Do you remember that?
I think that it was, but then you can check the record, it was in reference to the telephone number that he asked Gargi that he forgot his telephone, but he did not initiate the date. She is the one who initiated. I think that was the context.
You would agree in April of 2012, the defendant initiated by text the hiking date and all of the other banter before and after with Hillary Allen. You'd agree with that,
The
right?
hiking date that we, yes,
Yeah, that's all because of him, isn't it?
yes.
And in fact, when you were asked to dismiss that as not a very meaningful or social relationship, do you recall whether or not the defendant flirted openly with Hillary Allen over the texts? Do you recall that?
Yes.
What were the issues that led you to conclude he was flirting with her?
I think that, I believe that the exchange was that that you might be referring to, that she was wearing shorts and he was telling her, texting her during class that she's distracting him.
That's right. So this wasn't just some benign, I'm a girl, you're a guy, and we're just talking back and forth about nothing. He's trying to pursue something more than hiking. Don't you agree?
I cannot infer from a text that is sent, during a class that is making an effort to establish an intimate relationship with her the way he had with Gagi. I cannot infer.
Doctor, you were completely comfortable inferring with Mr. King that that was not a meaningful attempt at a relationship. Now that we've explored these extra details, why couldn't you infer something else?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor.
Because he did not pursue a relationship with her, to make a comment to go on a hiking trip where she and he was just going out on a date, and from him to send a text to her suggest that, he noted the legs and he sent the message. This is not a close social relationship. It might have been the beginning of it, but it didn't go anywhere.
And you know that he wanted one, correct?
He would have liked to have. It was important for him to have a relationship.
In fact, he even interpreted it as having a relationship, didn't he?
Maybe the beginning of a relationship that he wanted to pursue, but not like the relationship with Gargi.
So when he says to Doctors Fenton and Feinstein, I'm with another girl now, it's dangerous because she's in my neuropsych program, he's talking about Hillary Allen, correct?
Yes.
The statements that you got from the defendant in August of 2014, Mr. King asked you about regarding selfies being just a means by which he could show how he could obtain these weapons. You recall that exchange?
Yes.
You also recall that those statements he made to you came after the statements he made to Doctors Metzner and Doctors Reed about why he took those selfies?
Yes.
By the way, all the details of these opinions, and Mr. King asked you several times, is it your opinion? Is it your opinion? Those opinions are not expressed in any report that you've generated. Those are opinions you've expressed here in this room in July of 2015. Fair?
Yes.
Regards Dr. Reed asking questions and coming up with words and stuff, and the risk and the danger you described with Mr. King about that. As we've seen from the video, and I'm asking you if it's consistent with your experience, if someone were to suggest to the defendant something with which he disagreed, he readily disagreed with it, didn't he?
At times he did, and at times he was quiet and did not agree somewhat, but not fully disagree.
And finally, as pointed out by Mr. King, you had all of the exact same documents and information available to you that Doctors Metzner and Reed had available to them, correct?
I believe so.
They took the extra steps of calling a ton of people before they issued their opinions in their written reports, correct?
Yes.
And both of them are inconsistent with you on the issue of sanity in this case, correct?
Correct.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, it looks like the jury has a lot of questions. So, members of the jury, I'm going to send you out, stretch your legs, get a little rest, and then I will bring you back maybe 10, 15 minutes, okay? Please make sure you comply with my admonishments as usual. Thank you. And Dr. Gurr, I'll have you step out as well,
Okay.
please. Thank you. Everyone, please be seated. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. The record should also reflect that Dr. Gurr has exited the courtroom. There appear to be a lot of questions from the jury, so we'll get through these as quickly as we can. Okay, here we go. There are a bunch of questions. I have numbered all the forms. The first question, which is on the form that I've numbered as number 234, is as follows. How do you know what you inquired about but did not document? Do you have a list of questions you intended to ask Mr. Holmes? Is there any objection, Mr. King? Any objection, Mr. Brockler?
None, Your Honor.
Okay, it's an appropriate question. Next, on the same form, what is the margin of error on the IQ test given to Mr. Holmes? Any objection?
I think that's beyond the area of expertise that she was qualified as. She is a psychologist and may know about that, but I didn't qualify her in that area. So I think that may be beyond the scope of her expertise in this court.
All right, Mr. Brockler?
I kind of agree with that, Judge. I was going to say if she knew, but I tend to agree she wasn't qualified there.
I agree. I won't ask that question. The next question on the form, the same form, is since there is no video or audio of your interviews with Mr. Holmes, is it possible that you suggested answers, but do not recall, and this is a little strange. I don't know whether to read anything into this or not, but this question appears to be in different handwriting than the other two questions, which is odd, but I don't know if the juror just decided to use a different form of font or what's going on. But is there any objection, Mr. King?
Judge, that's concerning. That sounds like pre-deliberation to me. If these jurors are asking questions together, that's a problem.
Well, I'm not saying that they are. I don't know what's going on with this form, and I can ask him about it if you want, but it appears to be a different handwriting than the handwriting on the other two forms, so.
No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. King?
Minute, Your Honor. Maybe you could just inquire by a show of hands whether two people wrote their questions on the same form.
Okay, I'll do that. That's a reasonable approach. Do you have any objection to the question?
No, Judge.
Okay, I'll ask the question. The question is appropriate, assuming that it's coming from the same juror who wrote the other two questions on the form. All right, on the next form, which I have marked as number 235, the first question is, since Mr. Holmes did not show neurocognitive deficits across the board, is this a contraindication of schizophrenia? Any objection?
Struggling because he did show neurocognitive deficits across the board. So I guess we need to clear that up. So no, I don't object to the question.
Mr. Bruckler?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, I'll ask the question. It's appropriate. The next question is, as a doctor, what are the effects of Vicodin? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
If she knows, Your Honor.
I'll add if you know. The next question is, you mentioned that schizophrenia has an onset period of 2 to 3 years. Do you find the fact that Mr. Holmes had delusions of murder for at least 10 years prior to the murders a contraindication of schizophrenia as a diagnosis? Any objection?
No.
Any objection?
No, sir.
I will ask it. It's appropriate. The next question is on the form that I marked as number 236. The question is, what was Dr. Mel Lepsey's diagnosis that you referred to regarding Mr. Holmes? Any objection?
I don't think that there was a diagnosis because we don't have any of the records as she indicated, Your Honor, so we don't know. But I guess I have no objection to that question then.
Mr. Brockler?
I have no objection.
All right, I'll ask it without objection. It's an appropriate question. The next question on the same form is, did you ask Mr. Holmes about why he went to such elaborate means via his gear at the movie theater to protect himself if there is no meaning to life? For example, helmet, neck guard, leg protection. Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
And Your Honor.
I will ask it. It's appropriate. The next question is, did Mr. Holmes discuss with you why he chose to commit the murders at the Batman movie? Did his decision have anything to do with the content of that movie?
No objection.
No objection.
All right, the two-part question is appropriate. I will ask it. The next question is on the form that I have marked as number 247. Actually, is it 237? 237, excuse me, 237, yes. And the first question on that form is it possible that antipsychotic medications could change the size of the ventricles of a person's brain even slightly? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
If she knows, Your Honor.
All right, I will add if you know. The next question is, when you reviewed information from the I think it says from the caseworker who worked it's hard to read. It's counselor, not caseworker. It's counselor. But then I don't understand what comes after that. Who? It says walked. Walked to the park with the Holmes, with Mr. Holmes as a child. That's what I think it says. So it would read as follows. When you reviewed information from the counselor who walked to the park with Mr. Holmes as a child, in your diagnosis of Mr. Holmes, did you consider oppositional defiance disorder or autism spectrum disorder? Why or why not? What made you rule out autism spectrum disorder, narcissism, or a defiance type of disorder? Mr.
No
King-
objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
The next question on the form is, did you discuss with Mr. Holmes with respect to his notebook what he meant by a dark night rises? Did he indicate to you that he was the dark night that was finally rising? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask it, it's appropriate. I will ask all the questions on that form, the Form 237, as they are appropriate, and there's no objection. The next questions are on the form that I have marked as number 238, and there appear to be 6 questions. The first question is, given your testimony regarding your interest in and experience in schizophrenia, did you consider any other potential diagnosis for Mr. Holmes? If so, which one? That's actually 2 questions. Any objection?
No, sir.
Any objection?
None, Your Honor.
All right, next. On what basis did you rule out other diagnosis? Any objection?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Could some of the 5 domains of schizophrenia spectrum disorder also be included in other disorders, for example, disorganized thinking? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
The DSM-5, as shown to the jury, says schizotypal disorder is a personality disorder. What does that mean? Any objection?
No, sir.
No. Thank you, Your Honor.
Because Mr. Holmes always had anxiety regarding oral communications with other people and never had issues of cognition and drugs or alcohol. Doesn't that seem inconsistent from a typical case of onset of schizophrenia?
No objection.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, I will ask all of those questions that are on Form 238. That was the last one on Form 238. That's without objection, and because they all seem appropriate. The next bunch of questions are in the form that I have marked as number 239. The first question is, could Mr. Holmes be manipulative regarding the call for action? Mr. King?
Objection.
No objection.
The next question is, are there any tests to show a level of manipulation in a person/client?
No objection.
Mr. Bruckler?
If she knows, Your Honor.
I'll say if you know. The next question, if he was capable of manipulating, is there a way to know when he was being manipulative? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
What states are you licensed in? Any objection?
No objection.
No objection.
Does having a mental illness make a person insane? Any objection?
None.
None.
As a person progresses in their mental illness, does that change? Any objection?
No.
No objection, Your Honor.
And finally, on this Form 239, it has an asterisk next to it. As a mental health clinician, isn't it important to document everything? Everything is all capitalized in case you are not able to testify. Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
All right, without objection, I will ask all the questions on Form 239. The next multiple questions are on the form that I have marked as number 240. The first question is, besides the resolution and the MRI, is there any other difference? Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler,
No, sir.
I'll ask it. Next, with your experience, wouldn't you want to see the progression and the disease? Wouldn't you want to get a baseline so you can see if there is change? Mr. King,
Objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
The next one has an asterisk next to it, and the question is, wouldn't documenting help you defend or support your opinion? I don't know if defend is the right word. Maybe support is better. Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
And then the last question on Form 240 also has an asterisk. This is a follow-up to the last question on page A. Oh, that's what the asterisk means. Oh, I see. This person submitted 2 pages, page A and page B. So all these questions that I just read on Forms 239 and Forms 239 and 240 are from the same juror. So it's indicating that the asterisk, I think, refers to a follow-up to the question with an asterisk on 239. So, all right?
Yes.
I will ask all the questions on Form 240 without objection because I find that they're all appropriate. Next is the questions on Form 241. Just because someone has a serious mental illness, does that mean he is insane? Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
How do you know he was compliant with the medications prior to the shooting, or do you know? Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
I will ask both questions without objection. Those are the questions on Form 241. The next form is 242. During the beginning of questioning, you had to refer to your notes and report quite often. Wouldn't taking more notes during your interview better assist you when you have to testify? Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
I will ask the question without objection as it is appropriate. The next form is 243. The first question is, does someone with schizophrenia have a difficult time knowing right from wrong?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
And the second question on that form is, the fact that Mr. Holmes had been recovering from mono, what effect could the illness have on his mental health?
No objection.
If she knows, Your Honor.
I'll add if you know. Let me go back to the first question on this form. I'm just wondering if it's problematic because it doesn't refer to capacity. It refers to knowing right from wrong. Now, it's not specific to the defendant. It's asking about someone with schizophrenia. And it's asking if someone with schizophrenia would have a difficult time knowing right from wrong. If the parties don't have a concern, I will ask it. Do the parties have any concern? Mr. King?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Brockler?
I do have a concern with that, I guess, Your Honor, in light of the fact that the standard that we have kind of clung to here is the capacity question.
I just don't know what she's going to say in response to it, and then I don't know what door that's going to open to follow-up questions, so I'm not going to take any chances. I'm not going to ask that question. All right, the next question is the questions on the form that's marked as 244. And for the record, I will ask the other question on form 243. So I'm asking the second question on that form, not the first question. On form 244, we have 3 questions. The first question is, can someone who has schizophrenia appear normal to others, even friends and family? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Next, can someone who has schizophrenia go in and out of delusional thinking? Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
And finally, on Form 244, what effect does quitting psychotic medication called Turkey have on a person who is schizophrenic? Any objection?
I do have an objection, Judge, because Mr. Holmes was not taking antipsychotic medication. So that's not appropriate, so I would object.
I'm inclined to agree.
I do agree.
All right, I will not ask that question. But I will ask the other 2 questions on Form 244 that we just talked about because there is no objection and I find that the questions are appropriate. Next is the question on Form 245. The graduate school application that you referred to that indicated poor interviewing skill, etc. What school, what was the date, and do you know if Mr. Holmes was aware of the comments? Mr. King, any objection?
No.
Mr. Brockler, any objection?
If she knows, Your Honor.
I'll add if you know. All right, I will ask that question with the addition of if you know, without objection, because I think it's appropriate. Next is the question on form number 246. The question is, you refer to Mr. Holmes's IQ and level of intelligence a lot. Is someone who has a lower IQ or intelligence not capable of having a severe schizophrenia or mental disease as someone who has a higher IQ and higher level of intelligence? Why is IQ so important to mental disease? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
Without objection, I will ask it because I find that it's appropriate. Next are the questions on form number 247. The first question is, would anyone that has delusions be considered insane? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
Without objection, I will ask it, as I find it is appropriate. And then the final question on this form is, do delusions control the person? Or does the person control or evolve the delusions? Mr.
No
King?
objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
I will ask it without objection, as I think it is appropriate.
Your Honor, not to go backwards,
Say that again.
but the question about discontinuing the antipsychotic medication, I would have no objection to that question if the court were to change the wording from antipsychotic medication to SSRI, which is what he did stop taking.
That's question number 3 on form number 244. The question right now, as submitted by the juror, is what effect does quitting psychotic medication called Turkey have on a person who is schizophrenic? And what's the...
I'm just concerned, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Your Honor.
That's okay.
I'm just concerned, I thought it said antipsychotic medication, but if it says psychotic medication, I wonder if they're just referring to any kind of mental health medication. I don't know.
Right. In light of that, I think it's best not to ask it, so I will leave it omitted. And I may have incorrectly read it as antipsychotic. I don't remember whether I did or not, but the last question on Form 247 is, do delusions control the person, or does the person control or evolve the delusions? Did you say you didn't
No
have any-
objection.
No objection. Okay, Mr. Brockler?
Same thing, Your Honor.
All right, I'll ask it without objection, so I will ask both questions on Form 247 without objection because I find that they are appropriate. The next three questions are on the form that I have marked as number 248. The first question is schizophrenia a brain disorder, an illness, or a disease? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
Objection.
The next question is, how did you determine Mr. Holmes's verbal memory declined over time? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
And the final question on this form is, when rendering your opinion about sanity, do you go into the process assuming the person is sane and you have to be convinced otherwise, or that the person is insane and you must determine that they are sane? Does it make a difference either way? Mr. King?
Judge, I guess I would object to that question. I mean, the ultimate decision of sanity is up to the jury, and the burden is on the prosecution. So I don't want them to be confused. The doctors are testifying about capacity, so I would object to that question.
Mr. Brockler?
I don't have an objection, Your Honor.
Do you have a response to the objection, or do you feel strongly about this question?
Your Honor, I don't feel strongly about the question. I don't object to the question.
There have been experts who have talked about something similar, but I'm not going to ask the question. I'll sustain the objection. I'm not sure what exactly this is going to lead to, so I'll sustain the objection by the defense. So I will not ask the third question on Form 248, but I will ask the first two questions. On Form 249, we have two questions. The first one is, you said that most people with schizophrenia do not commit crimes. What differentiates someone with schizophrenia that does commit crimes from most people who have schizophrenia that do not commit crimes? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
And the last question on this form, what is the difference between prodromal, mildly psychotic, psychotic, and extremely psychotic? How do you decide at what point the severity changes? Mr. King?
Can you read the question again, please?
What is the difference between prodromal, mildly psychotic, psychotic, and extremely psychotic? And how do you decide at what point the severity changes?
I guess I have no objection to the question.
Do the people have any objection?
No, sir.
I will ask the two questions on Form 249, then including that last one without objection because I find that they are appropriate. The next question is the next questions are on the form that I've marked as 250. First question, if someone has one false belief one time, is that a delusion? Can delusions change or do they evolve? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
Objection.
I will ask that two-part question without objection, as I find that it is appropriate. The next question is, do you quantify delusions to determine severity? Mr. King?
Objection.
Mr. Brockler?
Objection.
Next, is it up to each individual psychiatrist's opinion to determine how severe someone's delusions are? Mr. King?
No objection.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler, no objection either. Okay. And finally, on this form, in your opinion, when would someone with schizophrenia not be able to determine right from wrong? And how would you know they are incapable of determining right from wrong?
No objection.
No objection.
All right, without objection, I will ask all the questions on Form 250 because I find that they're appropriate. Next are the questions on 251. First, what was the primary reason or evidence for you that helped you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane at the time of the crime? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
Next, at what point in the process did you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask both questions on Form 251 as I find that they're appropriate. The next question is on Form 252. How did you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane before the crime according to Colorado law and not after July 19, 20, 2012? Mr. King?
Can you repeat the question, please, Your Honor?
Yes. How did you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane before the crime according to Colorado law and not after July 19 and 20, 2012?
Judge, I would object to the question because that misstates Colorado law. The only question is whether he was insane on July 20th, 2012.
All right, Mr. Brockler?
I don't object, Your Honor. I think that the gist of the question is to say you declared him insane, I think from a prior question. How did you determine that that insanity predated the 19th or the 20th, or if that was something that occurred afterwards? That's my understanding of what's being asked.
Well, it assumes something that's not the case, that she did decide that, and that's not the case. So I think it's potentially misleading, Your Honor.
I think the juror is getting at what Mr. Brockler said, but I don't want to speculate, and so I think what the juror is actually intending to ask is, how did you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane on or about July 19 and 20 of 2012, and not after that? That whatever ailed him didn't happen after July 19 or 20, but. I don't want to speculate, so I will sustain the objection to that question. The next question is on the form that's marked as 253. The question is, in your expert opinion, can a person who is experiencing prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia spectrum disorder have their mental illness exacerbated by committing a crime that includes murdering people? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection, Your Honor.
Without objection, I will ask that question as I find that it is appropriate. The next four questions are in the form that I have marked as 254. The first question is, for the MRI study that you conducted, would the MRI machine be considered the constant variable of this research? Wouldn't the difference of the machines affect the study that you conducted with his brain and the 79 others? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
Next, how does the way that Dr. Reed asked questions differ from what you called probing as your way of questioning and pushing the defendant to answer or give answers? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
Next, are your notes that you take during evaluations, clinical or otherwise, an important piece of documentation in your practices?
No objection. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's a three-part question. Do you often rely on those notes in your practice? Do you teach your students to rely on those types of notes? Mr. King?
No objection.
No objection.
Okay, then the final question on this form is, knowing this is such a large case, why did you choose not to record your evaluations? Although your opinion is what is brought to court, do you feel that this would have supported your opinion and provided more information? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask all of the questions on Form 254 without objection, as they are all appropriate. The next couple of questions are on the form that I have marked as 255. The first question is, do you feel that your primary background in clinical psychiatry in any way affects your ability to distinguish between clinical and legal insanity determination? And what do you believe the key differences are between the two? Mr. King?
I'm not aware of any clinical insanity, but I guess I don't object to the question.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any clinical insanity either. I don't know what she's going to say, and I don't want her to confuse the other jurors. I have some concerns about this one.
On second thought, I agree with the court.
All right, I'm not going to ask that question. The next question on Form 255 is, the diagnosis of Mr. Holmes is within the same spectrum of mental illness between each of the evaluating doctors in this case, but the opinion of sanity varies. Can you tell us what facts regarding legal sanity you disagree with and why compared to Dr. Reed and Dr. Metzner's opinions? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection.
I will ask that question, but not the first question on Form 255. And the question that I'm asking is without objection because I find that it is appropriate. The next form is 256. In your opinion, if the defendant tried everything possible to stop his delusions or unwanted thoughts, then what would be the reason to turning down medication and continuing treatment? Mr. King,
No objection.
Mr. Brockler,
No objection if she knows or asked about that, Your Honor.
I'll say if you know. And I will ask that question without objection, but add if you know. Actually, looking back at it, it seems to call for speculation, unless it's something that he said to her. So it should be if you know, and if he said this, if he talked to you about this. Do the parties agree?
I do, Your Honor.
Mr. King?
I have no objection to that.
The next question. On Tuesday, you testified that you wrote 2 books saying that it's important to interview family members to get their observations prior to diagnosing schizophrenia. Then why did you testify today that interviewing his parents was irrelevant in this case? Mr. King.
Well, that's not what she said. But I guess I don't object to the question.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection, sir.
All right, I will ask both questions on Form 256 without objection because I find that they're appropriate. The first question on Form 257 is, what was the deciding factor, in your opinion, that the defendant did not have the capacity to know right from wrong on July 20, 2012? This may have been asked by another juror. I can't remember now.
Seems like it was, but I have no objection to the question unless it's cumulative.
I don't have any objection, Your Honor.
I'll ask it. I can't remember now if it was included. I think it was included. But without objection, I'll ask it. The next question is, if disorganized thoughts, and then in parentheses it says speech, is a common symptom in schizophrenia, can you give an example of the defendant's disorganized thoughts and why you determine it as disorganized? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection, Your Honor.
So I will ask both questions on Form 257 without objection, as I find that they're appropriate. The question on Form 258 is as follows. Are you using actual quotes from the defendant, or are you paraphrasing in your report? Wouldn't it be beneficial to write down exact quotes directly after the defendant states it to ensure accuracy when writing your report? Mr. King?
No objection.
Mr. Brockler?
No objection, Your Honor.
The next question is on Form 259. The question is, why wasn't it important to take detailed notes, especially in a case such as this? Is it your normal practice to use your memory for what every patient says instead of taking detailed notes? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
I will ask it without objection because I find that it's appropriate. The final question is on the form that I have marked as number 260. The question is, was Mr. Holmes more verbal during your last 2 interviews compared to the first 2? Mr. King.
No objection.
Mr. Brockler.
No objection.
I will ask it without objection because I find that it is appropriate. And Mr. King, you're asking me to inquire of the jurors just by a show of hands if 2 of them wrote questions on the same form. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Any objection from the people? By the way, you can take a look at the form. If you want to approach, why don't Mr. Brockler and Mr. King approach, and you'll see what I'm referring to. This is Form 234, and it's questions 1 and 2 on the one hand and 3 on the other. Yeah, I think both of them are saying that it could be the same person just writing in cursive, and that's a possibility. All right, let's bring the jury back in, and let's bring Dr. Gurr back in, please. Yeah, we can take 5 minutes, but let's make it just 5 minutes so we can get Dr. Gurr out of here on time. Actually, before you do, Mr. King, so after I ask the questions of Dr. Gurr, and there are follow-up questions asked, if any, then at that point, I'm going to ask you for your next witness, and you're going to call your investigator. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then any other plans after that?
Then we're gonna play 15 minutes of the exhibits from the jail,
Okay,
and then the rest.
and, well, I have to do finish the Curtis advisement first before you rest.
Oh, wait, Your Honor, I'm being reminded. Yeah. There are actually two videos play, Your Honor.
Okay,
One is the surveillance video from hospital.
okay,
That was admitted. And then the second one is 15 minutes. The short video from the hospital is DTR 95. Of his DTR 69.
so how long are those two videos together? And when I say together, I'm not asking you and Ms. Spengler to answer the question together, I'm just asking the two videos together. $45 minutes?
One hospital.
It's 45 minutes total. Mr. King?
It's 45 minutes total.
I know. Ms. Higgs was giving me the answer from the back, but probably less time than what we took to figure out how long it was, but that's okay.
I'm hearing voices.
All right. We'll be on break for about 5 minutes. The court will be in recess.